The clock struck 11 p.m. as Emma sat at the front desk of the aging hospital, the glow of the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. It was one of those nights, quiet, still, and unnervingly empty. The night shift at St. Michael's Hospital was always lonely, but tonight felt different. The quiet hum of machines, the distant murmur of nurses on the other floors, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps were the only sounds. The kind of night where every creak of the building's old bones seemed louder than it actually was. Emma, a new receptionist, was still getting used to the eerie atmosphere. She had heard the stories, the ones the nurses whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Stories of things that go bump in the night, of strange occurrences that no one could explain. But Emma, being a skeptic, had dismissed them all as nothing more than superstitions. That was until tonight. It started with the shadows. At first, she thought it was just her tired eyes playing tricks on her. The dim light of the desk lamp cast long, jagged shadows down the hospital hallways, and the noise of her pen tapping nervously against the countertop did nothing to help her focus. But then, something caught her eye, a figure moving just out of her peripheral vision. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She jerked her head toward the hallway, but there was nothing there, just a dull, gray wall stretching endlessly in both directions. The night shift was always quiet, but this felt different, as if something was watching her. A chill ran down her spine, and she rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the sudden unease. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. She was just tired, nothing more. The hours dragged on. By 1 a.m., Emma's eyelids were heavy, and the temptation to rest her eyes for just a few minutes was becoming overwhelming. That's when it happened. A loud, unmistakable sound echoed from the end of the hallway, a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was knocking gently on a door. Emma froze. The sound wasn't coming from the nurse's station, nor the staff rooms where the night shift team was supposed to be. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the hospital, from the isolated back corridors where few ever went after hours. The sound was faint but steady. Tap, 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 coming closer. Her breathing hitched. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. Silence. But the tapping continued, growing louder, as if the person was walking directly toward her. A wave of dread surged through her chest, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She hesitated. Should she call for help? Her phone was only an arm's length away. But somehow, she felt paralyzed, as if some unseen force was keeping her from reaching for it. The tapping stopped abruptly. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind. But as Emma strained to listen, she realized it was coming from the same direction as the tapping. Emma? Her name. The voice was soft, almost too soft, like a distant memory calling her back. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she stood up from the desk, her legs shaking. There was no one there. No one at all. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees, and she could see her breath in the cold air. A sudden, overpowering urge to leave flooded her mind, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispering voice came again, this time clearer. "Don't look behind you." Her blood ran cold. She slowly, reluctantly, turned her head, her gaze falling on the hallway behind her. The long, dim corridor stretched before her like a black void. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hall. A man, dressed in a hospital gown, his back to her. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. His thin frame was illuminated by the soft light from the emergency exit signs, and his head hung low, as if in deep sorrow. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her instincts telling her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Her mouth went dry, and she felt like her heart was going to explode in her chest. She swallowed hard, trying to gather her courage. "Hello." Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. No response. Then the man began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he turned around. Emma's pulse raced as the figure came into view. His face was hollow, gaunt, as if drained of all life. His eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to pierce right through her. She couldn't look away. His expression remained unchanged, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, just staring at her. His lips parted slightly, and he whispered again, "Help me?" A wave of nausea hit Emma, and she stumbled back, knocking over a stack of papers. The sound of them scattering across the floor seemed to snap her out of her trance. She took a shaky step forward, trying to regain her composure. But when she looked back toward the hallway, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty again. The oppressive silence returned, but the heavy sense of dread remained, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Emma stood there, frozen, tried to make sense of what she had just seen. Had she imagined it? Was she just sleep-deprived? Or had something truly paranormal just happened? Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She called a nursing station, her voice shaky. "I need someone to check the back hallways. Something's wrong." The line went dead. Before she could react, the whisper came again, soft and insistent, as though the figure was standing right behind her. "Don't turn around." Emma's heart skipped a beat, her breath hitching in her throat. The whisper was so close now that she could almost feel the cold breath on the back of her neck. She didn't dare to turn around. The chill in the air was unbearable, and her legs trembled beneath her, as though they were about to give way. "Don't turn around." The voice repeated, this time clearer, with an edge of urgency. There was something so unnervingly familiar about the tone, as if it belonged to someone she once knew, someone she hadn't seen in years. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. It was impossible to make sense of this. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet, the air felt thick, as if it were pressing in on her. The hospital, once just a cold, impersonal building, now felt alive with something malevolent, something watching her from the shadows. Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could offer an explanation. The hallway in front of her remained empty, but the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was as if the very walls themselves were alive, holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence in the room grew heavier, more suffocating, and Emma took a slow, hesitant step back. Her fingers hovered near the desk drawer where the security keys were kept. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of there. But the voice, it was as though it had rooted itself deep in her mind, refusing to let her go. "Don't turn around." The words echoed in her head, reverberating with a cruel, mocking tone. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped in place, like prey frozen under the gaze of a predator. The unease in the pit of her stomach twisted tighter. "What is this? Help me?" The voice, faint and mournful, came again. This time, it wasn't in her head. It wasn't a whisper. It was a cry, a desperate plea for help, coming from a hallway. Emma's pulse quickened and her skin prickled. She couldn't tell if it was the same voice from before, but something about the way it sounded made her blood run cold. Without thinking, she bolted from her desk and ran toward the hallway, her feet pounding the cold linoleum floor. The corridor stretched out before her, seemingly endless, bathed in the flickering glow of the overhead lights. The farther she went, the darker it became. The lights overhead sputtered in and out, casting brief shadows that seemed to shift and move as though alive. Emma's breathing became shallow, panicked. She rounded a corner, eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of life. But it was empty, dead silent. No figure at the end of the hallway. No footsteps. Just a whispering wind through the cracks of the building. She exhaled a shaky breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe it was just the stress, the loneliness of the night shift getting to her. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. She gripped the edge of the wall, trying to steady herself. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the silence was shattered again. A loud bang echoed down the hall, coming from the farthest corner, near the old storage room. The sound of something heavy being knocked over. A crash, followed by the sound of dragging footsteps. Emma froze, eyes wide, and her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if something was coming toward her. She turned and looked down the hallway, but there was nothing, just darkness. The hospital was unnaturally quiet again, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. But there was no answer. Only the sound of those dragging footsteps, now unmistakable. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and Emma's heart raced. The temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into her bones. She turned back toward the desk, wanted to flee the hospital and never look back. But something inside her, some primal part of her, urged her to stay, to find out what was happening. She took one more step toward the source of noise, her legs shaking with every movement. The hallway was still empty, but as she neared the storage room, she felt the presence. Something was there, just out of sight, but close enough for her to feel it. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered once more, "Help me?" It was no longer a distant voice, but one that sounded as if it was directly behind her. Emma spun around, her heart hammering against her ribcage. But once again, there was no one, just the empty, haunting hallway, now colder than ever. She had to leave. This was madness. But before she could turn to run, something grabbed her arm, ice-cold, bony fingers that dug into her flesh. She gasped, the breath knocked out of her, and whirled around to find nothing, no one. Yet the grip on her arm was still there, tight and unyielding, as though invisible hands were holding her back. The air seemed to freeze, her vision blurring, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled backward, desperate to break free of whatever unseen force had a hold on her. But the grip remained, dragging her closer to the darkness. And then, in the far distance, she saw him, the man in the hospital gown. His face, pale and gaunt, stared at her from the edge of the hallway, his black eyes fixed on her with an unblinking intensity. He took a step toward her, slow and deliberate. Every movement filled her with dread, and Emma's breath became shallow, her vision narrowing as panic set in. "Help me?" She couldn't tell if it was a plea or a command. The man was getting closer now, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the empty hallway. Emma's legs buckled beneath her, but she couldn't break free. The grip on her arm tightened further, and she realized, with chilling clarity, that it wasn't just a man watching her. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting. As she fought to pull away, she heard the sound of his voice again, this time clearer than ever. "Please don't leave me." Suddenly, the temperature in the hallway dropped even further, and Emma felt her body go numb, the cold seeping deep into her bones. Her eyes darted around frantically, searching for an escape, but there was no way out. She was trapped in this hallway, with this thing, this ghost of something long forgotten. The man reached out his hand toward her, his fingers stretching impossibly long. And then, as if driven by some unseen force, Emma screamed, her voice cracking with fear as the dark figure closed the distance between them, and the world around her disappeared. Emma's scream echoed down the hallway, but no sound came from her mouth. It was as if the air itself had swallowed her voice. Her vision blurred as the icy grip on her arm pulled her further into the darkness. She struggled, but her body felt heavy, like she was wading through thick mud. The coldness deepened, suffocating her from all sides, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, closing around her. The figure, the man, moved closer, his skeletal form gliding soundlessly through the hospital. His hollow eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist into knots. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. His gaze held her in place, frozen, unable to break free from his pull. As he drew nearer, Emma could feel his presence more acutely, like an oppressive weight on her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale feeling more strained than the last. She fought to remain conscious, her mind spiraling into panic. "Please," the man whispered again, his voice barely audible, yet it seemed to vibrate through her skull. "Help me?" His words sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Was he asking for help, or was this some twisted mockery? A lure to draw her deeper into whatever nightmare this was? She couldn't tell. The more she tried to understand, the more lost she became. The grip on her arm tightened, colder now, like ice digging into her skin. She winced, the pain making her mind foggy, but she fought against the numbness creeping up her limbs. She had to break free. She had to run. But her legs, her arms, her entire body seemed paralyzed, locked in place by something more powerful than fear. She looked down at his hand, a pale, bony hand that now clutched her arm with an unnatural strength. His fingers were long, thin, like they didn't belong to a living person. The skin was cracked and dry, stretched taut over his bones. He wasn't human. She had no idea what he was, but she knew one thing. He was not alive, and yet he felt real. His presence was undeniable. His fingers burned with an icy cold that seeped into her very soul. "Help me," he repeated, his voice tinged with desperation. "Please, I'm trapped." Emma's eyes darted around, frantic, searching for any sign of help, any way to escape this nightmare. But the hallway was empty, as it had always been. The hospital felt like a maze now, stretching on endlessly, devoid of any sense of direction or safety. The dim lights flickered above, casting strange shadows that danced and shifted like they were alive. Then, without warning, the man lunged forward, his cold fingers brushing against Emma's cheek, sending a shock of ice through her body. Her heart skipped a beat, and she gasped, her chest tightening in fear. His lips parted, and for a split second, Emma thought she saw something, a glimpse of his face, of what he truly was, beneath the hollow skin, beneath the mass of decay. His eyes were empty, hollow, but behind that emptiness was something darker, a longing, a sorrow that seemed to transcend the mortal world. He was begging her to help him, and yet something was wrong. She felt it in her bones. She could feel the malevolent energy that emanated from him, seeping into her own soul, trying to break her. "Who are you?" Emma choked out, her voice hoarse. The question escaped before she could stop herself. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of this figure, who wasn't quite human, but not quite a ghost either. What was he? What did he want? His lips twitched into what could only be described as a grim smile, if it could even be called that. The smile was full of sorrow, full of torment, and then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, but filled with a strange finality. "I'm the one who never left." Before she could process his words, the grip on her arm suddenly released. Emma stumbled backward, her body jerking away from him in a panic. She barely caught herself against the wall, her heart racing. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as the coldness began to retreat. The man stood before her, his face, if you could call it that, twisted with something resembling grief. His eyes never left hers, not for a second. It was as if he was trying to convey something important, but the message was lost on her. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he began to fade. His body started to dissipate, melting into the shadows as if it were made of smoke. The hallway around her darkened with each passing second, the coldness receding like a dying breath. The last thing Emma saw before he disappeared completely were his eyes, those hollow, empty eyes that still seemed to pierce through her, right into her very soul. Then silence. The cold left her, and the overwhelming sense of dread lifted slightly. The hallway was once again quiet, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the air. Emma stood there, her body trembling uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. What was that? Was it a ghost? Was it real? No, she couldn't process it. Her thoughts were too tangled. She stumbled back toward the front desk, her legs weak, but when she reached it, she was met with an eerie sight. The phone line was still dead. The hospital was as quiet as it had been when she first arrived. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. But there was something else, something far worse. The figure was still in her mind. His eyes, his voice. He's the one who never left. Suddenly, the lights overhead flickered violently, casting sharp shadows along the walls. The air grew thick again, pressing it around her like a vice. And then, from the far end of the hallway, she heard it again, the tapping, slow, methodical, tap, 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 as if someone was walking toward her, step by step. But it wasn't just the sound of footsteps that chilled her to the bone. It was the fact that no one was there. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her. As the tapping grew louder, her skin began to crawl. She turned toward the exit, but it seemed so far away now. The hospital that had once seemed so familiar now felt like an unfamiliar labyrinth, a place trapped in time, A place where things that should not exist lingered, waiting. With a sudden, sharp snap, the lights flickered off entirely, plunging Emma into darkness. The tapping stopped. The air was thick with silence. Her heart raced in the black void. And then in the utter stillness, a voice, barely a whisper, echoed in her ear, so close that it felt as if it were right inside her mind. "You're next." The whisper was deafening in the silence. "You're next." The voice echoed through Emma's skull, louder than anything she had ever heard before. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she spun around, frantically searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, no figure in sight, no ghostly figure standing in the dark, just the oppressive blackness, pressing it on her from all sides. Her breath was shallow, and her legs quivered beneath her. She had to move, had to get out of here. The weight of the night, the strange, suffocating presence, the things she had seen, all of it threatened to crush her. But as she stood frozen in place, her mind began to race, desperately trying to find an explanation for what was happening. The man, the one who had appeared in the hallway, he wasn't just any ghost. His hollow eyes, they weren't just empty sockets. No, there was something else there, something that Emma couldn't fully grasp, but it gnawed at her from within. "I'm the one who never left." His words rang through her mind, and a horrifying thought crossed her consciousness. What if he wasn't alone? What if there were others like him? Before she could dwell on the thought further, a noise from behind her snapped her back to reality. A soft, scraping sound, as if something was being dragged across the floor. Emma turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, but the shadows seemed to move and shift in unnatural ways, cloaking the hallway in a veil of confusion. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was coming toward her. Her heart beat wildly, and she instinctively backed up toward the desk, her fingers searching for something to steady herself. The silence that followed the footsteps only made her more anxious. She didn't dare to turn around. And then, the flickering lights above her suddenly came to life, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. Each flicker seemed to take longer than the last, as if something was draining the hospital of its very energy. And just as quickly as they flickered on, they went out again, leaving her in total darkness. But something was different now. Through the oppressive blackness, Emma could hear something else. A low, guttural growl, deep in the far end of the hallway. The sound vibrated through her bones. Something was waiting. For a moment, the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the growl lingering in the air like a promise. Emma's mind swirled with horror as she realized what was happening. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Her instinct screamed at her to run. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to get out of this place, whatever it took. But when she turned toward the exit, her legs suddenly betrayed her, and she stumbled forward, colliding with the desk. The loud bang of her body hitting what seemed to break the spell of silence. But it also triggered something else. There was movement now. From the dark recesses of the hallway, something stepped into view. At first, it was just a shadow, but the shape quickly solidified. A figure, tall and broad, with hunched shoulders and elongated limbs that seemed to crawl like a spider's legs. Emma froze. The creature, a twisted version of a human, stood motionless, staring at her with wide, bulging eyes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretching tight over its bones like old paper. It didn't move, but Emma could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her with every passing second. The growl she had heard earlier was now unmistakable. It came from this creature, a low, rumbling noise that vibrated through her chest. Emma's breath hitched. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't. She was paralyzed, her legs locked in place, her body refusing to obey her frantic mind. The creature's eyes glinted in the dim light, its gaze never leaving hers. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Emma's blood ran cold as the voice echoed in her mind. The words didn't come from the creature's mouth. No, they reverberated in the very air around her, as if the building itself were speaking to her. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and her mind raced to make sense of the words. The creature took a step forward, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. The sound of bones cracking and shifting filled the air, and the growl intensified. Emma stumbled backward, her mind fighting to keep her grounded in the reality she knew. But with every movement, every step the creature took toward her, the hospital seemed to bend, to distort around her, as if it were no longer a place of safety, but twisted reflection of something far darker. You shouldn't have stayed. The voice came again, this time louder, as if it were inside her head. The walls around her seemed to pulse with life, closing in around her. Suddenly, the creature lunged. Its hands shot out, elongated fingers reaching for Emma's throat with terrifying speed. She screamed, managing to dodge its grasp by mere inches. The force of its movement sent her crashing into the wall, her body crumpling to the cold floor. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the creature loomed over her, its grotesque face just inches away. She could see the jagged teeth lining its mouth and the hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. The stench of decay filled the air, suffocating her with every breath. "I never left," the creature hissed, its voice barely above a whisper now. But the words felt like a weight in her chest. "I've been here waiting." As its long fingers reached for her again, Emma's mind snapped into overdrive. She couldn't just lay there, couldn't just accept the fate this thing was offering her. She had to fight. Her hands scrambled around the floor, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against something cold and hard. She grabbed it instinctively, a metal bar from the broken desk. With all the strength she could muster, Emma swung the bar upward, connecting it with the creature's arm. It howled in pain, the sound high-pitched and unnatural. But the force of strike caused its arm to snap back, giving Emma just enough time to roll away from its reach. She didn't stop to look back. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in short gasps. There was no time to think. There was no time to wonder what this thing was. All that mattered now was escaping. With the creature still howling in fury behind her, Emma bolted down the hallway, toward the only exit she could see, the stairwell. She heard it following her, its footfalls heavy and deliberate. She couldn't afford to look behind her. She had to keep running. She threw open the door to the stairwell, praying it would lead her to freedom. But as the door slammed shut behind her, a chilling realization washed over her. She was still trapped inside a building where the walls themselves seemed to hunger for her. And as she descended the stairs, the cold voice of the creature whispered again in her ear, "You can't escape." The stairwell was a blur as Emma sprinted down the narrow steps, her feet barely able to keep up with her panic-driven movements. The sound of her shoes slapping against the metal steps reverberated in the hollow, empty space, making the air feel even heavier. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. The creature's voice, cold and mocking, still echoed in her mind. "You can't escape." It was a terrifying truth. But the more she ran, the more she realized that it wasn't just the creature she had to outrun. It was everything. The hospital itself felt alive with a terrible, ancient presence that she couldn't understand. The stairwell stretched endlessly, each flight of stairs growing steeper, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on her, as if they were conspiring to trap her within their cold, unforgiving grasp. Sweat poured down her face, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she descended further into the darkness below. The air grew thicker with every step. The once cold chill had turned into an oppressive heat, suffocating her, making her skin crawl. She had never felt more alone, more desperate. The further she descended, the more the sense of dread grew. It wasn't just the creature behind her. No, there was something worse, something ancient buried beneath the floors of the hospital, something waiting. The lights in the stairwell flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The flickering grew more erratic, as if the building itself were struggling to maintain its grip on reality. Emma's mind was spinning, the terror mounting with every passing second. Was she losing her mind, or was something far worse happening? Keep moving. She forced the thought through her mind, using it to push herself further. The stairwell felt like an endless void, and she wasn't sure how much farther she could go. The growl returned. A low, rumbling sound reverberated from deep within the building, more guttural and menacing than before. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, grating against her eardrums with every thundering growl. Emma's heart rate spiked as she realized it wasn't just a creature. The growl came from something deeper, from the bowels of the hospital, from something ancient and far more terrifying than she could comprehend. Her mind flashed to the man she had seen earlier, the one who had warned her. "I'm the one who never left." His words haunted her, and she suddenly understood this place wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by something older, something that had lived beneath its foundation for years, perhaps even centuries. Her steps faltered as she approached the bottom of the stairwell. Her legs were like lead, trembling with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let herself fall victim to whatever this was. She had to find the exit. She had to escape. As she reached the last step, her foot collided with something soft and unexpected. She stumbled, barely catching herself on a railing, but as she looked down, her blood ran cold. Beneath her feet was a layer of what looked like old, rotting hospital gowns, their pale white fabric stained with dark splotches of red and brown. She recoiled, a wave of nausea hitting her gut. The gowns weren't just discarded. They were carefully piled, arranged in a disturbing pattern that seemed to form some kind of grotesque, ritualistic symbol. Suddenly, the lights above her flickered out completely, plunging her into darkness once again. The growl intensified, rising to an almost deafening roar, and Emma's heart seemed to stop in her chest. The darkness pressing on her, but she dared not look back. Something was coming. "I have to get out of here," she thought, but her legs were like stone. She pushed forward, blindly feeling her way through the dark, her hands brushing against the walls as she stumbled through the unknown. She didn't know how far she had descended, but there was a heavy weight in the air, something dark and oppressive. The deeper she went, the more the atmosphere felt like an abyss. A whisper, soft at first, reached her ears. "Help me?" The voice came from all around her, like the sound of 1,000 voices whispering in unison. She gasped, turning in every direction, but there was no one there, no figure, nothing but the suffocating silence of the basement. Then the temperature dropped again. She could see her breath forming in the air, a visible puff in the otherwise stagnant air. And then she heard it, a soft, dragging sound, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps. It was closer now. The presence was near. Her heart began to pound violently in her chest as she realized that whatever she'd been running from was right behind her. Every hair on the back of her neck stood on end as the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. The sound of heavy breathing filled the air, and Emma froze, too terrified to move. She could feel it now, its presence right behind her, as though it were standing just inches away. And then it spoke again. This time, the voice was clear, and it sent a chill down her spine. "You should have left when you had the chance." The words were like a curse, vibrating in her bones. Before she could react, the growl erupted into a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if something deep within the earth was awakening. The walls buckled and groaned, and the very air seemed to collapse in on itself. Emma turned and bolted, not knowing where she was running anymore. The footsteps followed, too close now. She could hear the creature's breath, hot and ragged, right behind her. The growl was now a roar, vibrating through her entire body, sending her into a panic frenzy. She reached a door at the far end of the corridor, her trembling hands grabbing the handle. It turned easily, almost too easily, as if it had been waiting for her. She yanked it open, desperate for any escape. What she saw beyond that door took her breath away. The room was massive, larger than any room she had ever seen in a hospital, and it stretched downward into the darkness like an abyss. The walls were lined with what looked like old medical equipment, long abandoned, their rusted surfaces coated with dust. But the most disturbing thing was the sight of hundreds, thousands of hospital gowns hanging from the ceiling. Their tattered fabric swayed in the still air, like corpses suspended in time. And at the far end of the room, a figure stood. It was not the creature she had encountered before, but it was worse. Far worse. This figure was not human. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and twisted features, its face half melted, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, sickly light. and it was looking right at her. "You're too late," the figure hissed, its voice 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. "You should have left. You can never escape." Emma stumbled backward, her heart racing in her chest. She had nowhere to run. And then, from the darkness, something even worse emerged. Emma's heart pounded against her ribcage, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the figure before her twisted and writhed in the shadows. It was no longer just a man or a creature. It was something beyond that, something that shouldn't exist. Its body was a grotesque mixture of writhing limbs. Its skin stretched too tightly over bones that looked like they'd been pulled from some ancient nightmare. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, pierced into her with the weight of 1,000 years of suffering. For a moment, Emma couldn't move. She stood there, paralyzed by fear, watching as the creature took a slow step toward her. Each movement it made was deliberate, inhuman, as though it were savoring the moment, relishing the terror that it could sense radiating from her. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive, like the very atmosphere was closing in around her. It spoke again, but this time, its voice was a chorus of whispers, overlapping and discordant, like 100 voices had merged into one. "You should have left when you had the chance." The words slithered into Emma's mind, twisting around her thoughts, suffocating them. She could feel her grip on reality starting to slip, the edges of her vision blurring, as if the room itself were warping, stretching. The walls seemed to pulse with life. The hospital gown-covered ceiling rippling like a sea of dead fabric. "You're too late," it repeated, its voice now rising in pitch, filled with a cruel satisfaction. She shook her head violently, as if to clear the fog in her mind. The creature was advancing, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. Its twisted form seemed to shimmer with malevolence, and as it drew nearer, the air became colder, the temperature plunging to an unbearable chill. Emma's teeth began to chatter from the cold, and her skin crawled with the unmistakable sensation of something watching her every move. She needed to think. She needed to do something, but her legs refused to cooperate. Her mind paralyzed by the terror that gripped her heart. She was trapped in this nightmarish labyrinth, with no way out. The creature was getting closer, its rancid breath now hot on her face. She could smell the rot emanating from its body, like death itself had been allowed to fester here for far too long. Suddenly, she felt a sharp, gut-wrenching pull in her chest, as if something deep within the room had latched onto her very soul. Her vision blurred even more, and she could hear the whispers grow louder. So many voices, overlapping, speaking in unison. "You're ours now," they said, their voices hollow and suffocating. The room around her began to distort, the hospital gowns hanging from the ceiling twisting and shifting in the air as if alive. They stretched and snapped like the tendrils of some monstrous creature, reaching for her, closing around her like a net. She tried to move, to run, but it was as if the room itself was holding her in place, trapping her within its decaying walls. "No, no, no, no," Emma whispered, her voice shaking as she clawed at the air, tried to fight off the creeping darkness that seemed to engulf her every step. But the creature continued its slow advance, each step bringing it closer to her. Its grotesque body rippled with unnatural movement, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Emma could see its long, spindly fingers curling into claws as it neared, its mouth splitting open in a hideous grin, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. Its eyes gleamed with predatory hunger. And then the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. In that moment of stillness, the creature froze, its glowing eyes narrowing as it tilted its head to one side. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What was it waiting for? Why had it stopped? Then she heard it, a soft, familiar voice, quiet, like a whisper from a far-off dream, echoed through the room. "Emma?" she gasped, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a voice she recognized. It was her mother's voice. "Emma, you need to wake up." For a brief, fleeting moment, Emma felt her chest tighten with something other than fear. It was a pang of longing, a desperate, unreachable hope. She turned toward the sound of the voice, but the room around her began to shift and blur once more. The walls melted and stretched like liquid, and the air grew thick with an oppressive force, suffocating her thoughts. "Emma, don't let it take you." The voice was fading, growing weaker by the second, but it fueled her with a sense of urgency. She could feel her mind starting to crack, the edges of her consciousness slipping away. But in the deep recesses of her mind, something inside her screamed, fight, with all the strength she could muster. Emma tore her eyes away from the creature, forcing herself to focus on the fading voice. She pushed through the weight in the air, every part of her aching as if she were moving through quicksand. The twisted figure in front of her was still frozen, watching, waiting. It was the perfect moment. She had no idea what was happening, but her instincts kicked in a wild, desperate motion. Emma turned on her heel and ran as fast as her legs could carry her. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what was real or what wasn't. The only thing that mattered was that she couldn't stay here, not for one more second. Her feet pounded against the floor as she tore through the shifting, collapsing hallway. The walls closed in around her, their grotesque, writhing forms pulling at her with terrifying force. The air grew colder, suffocating, but she pushed forward, her thoughts racing. She had to get out. She had to survive. Suddenly, a blinding light flickered ahead of her, a doorway. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Emma's eyes locked onto the light, and she ran toward it with everything she had. The ground shook beneath her as the creature roared behind her, the sound splitting her mind in two. She didn't dare look back. The light grew brighter, blinding her with its intensity. She stumbled forward, her chest heaving, her legs trembling from exhaustion. And then, as if she were crossing the threshold into a new reality, she felt herself being pulled through the light, through the veil of this twisted nightmare. The world around her shattered. The hospital, the creature, the terror. It all melted away, leaving Emma in a place that was strangely quiet. Her heart was still racing, but her surroundings were no longer dark, no longer twisted. She could hear birds chirping faintly in the distance, and the air felt fresh, as if she had stepped out of the nightmare and into daylight. But as Emma stood there, in the fading light of whatever world this was, the voice spoke again. This time, it was clear and unmistakable. You can never escape, Emma. And as she turned, the walls of the hospital faded back into view, surrounding her once again. Emma stood frozen in place, her heart pounding against her chest as the voice reverberated through her mind. You can never escape, Emma. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a presence, a suffocating weight on her very soul. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her wide eyes frantically scanning the area. She was back in the hospital. The familiar. Cold walls loomed around her once again, their cracked surfaces and rusting pipes mocking her futile attempts to escape. The light that had once filled the space was now a dim glow, flickering sporadically like a dying star. The sense of dread that had overtaken her in the lower levels was back, this time amplified. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the taste of mold and dust heavy on her tongue. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. How was she here? She had been in the stairwell just moments ago, running, fighting, escaping. She had felt the creature behind her, the weight of its breath on her neck. But now, the space around her was different. The hospital stretched out before her in an endless maze of hallways, each one darker and more twisted than the last. The sound of the building, the groans, the whispers, the faint footsteps, were louder now, vibrating through her very bones. It was like a nightmare, but she couldn't wake up. You are not leaving, the voice hissed again, its tone low, filled with malicious glee. Her pulse quickened, and Emma took a step back, her feet unsteady. But as soon as she moved, the hallway seemed to stretch farther, the doorways further out of reach. She couldn't see the exit, couldn't find the stairs or the way to the outside world. The hospital was alive. It was changing, shifting, trapping her. No, I can't stay here. I won't. Her thoughts raced, her mind a storm of fear and confusion. She had to get out. She had to find a way. There had to be a way out. As she turned, her eyes caught something at the end of the hallway. A flicker of movement. At first, it seemed like a shadow, a trick of the dim light. But as she focused, she saw it more clearly. A figure. It was the man. The same man she had seen earlier in the hallway. The one who had appeared to warn her. The one who had said, "I never left." His eyes were still hollow, dark void where there should have been life. But now he was closer, far closer, standing at the far end of the hallway. His posture was unnervingly still, his head tilted slightly as he stared at her with that same unsettling gaze. Emma's breath hitched. She didn't want to approach him. She didn't want to face him. But there was something in his stillness that compelled her. Some strange magnetic pull that kept her feet rooted to the ground. "Help me," his voice called, distant yet piercing. It was a command, a plea, a warning. With a single step, Emma found herself moving forward, her body betraying her every instinct. Her feet seemed to carry her toward him, though her mind screamed for her to turn and run. She wanted to call out to him, to demand answers, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the overwhelming silence of the hospital. As she drew closer, the light above flickered once more. It cast the hallway in a sickly glow, revealing things that made Emma's stomach churn. Bloodstains smeared the walls. Handprints, too, as though something had dragged itself along the corridors. And the floor was uneven, as though it had been torn apart and hastily put back together. The man, if he could even be called that, was standing motionless, his eyes locked onto hers. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, the whispering started again, softer this time, like 1,000 voices speaking all at once. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" The voices came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. It felt as though the building itself was alive, suffocating her with its endless murmurings. "What do you want from me?" Emma cried out, her voice shaking, desperation lacing every word. She wanted answers. She needed to know what was happening. She needed to know how to stop this nightmare. The man's head tilted even further, a grotesque and unnatural angle, and then with slow, deliberate movements he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, the words barely audible over the rising whispers. "I am what remains." Emma felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The hospital itself seemed to respond to the man's words, its walls groaning as if they were alive, as though the very structure of the building had been altered by the force of his presence. "You are here because you belong here," the man continued, his voice becoming clearer. "This place, this cursed place, it feeds on those like you. You can never escape. You were never meant to leave." Emma's mind reeled. His words didn't make sense. She had been running, trying to survive, but now it seemed that survival was impossible. The thing, the creature, had been right all along. There was no escape. She could feel the terror closing in on her, the walls pressing in tighter, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. She tried to back away, but it was as though her feet were glued to the floor. She was paralyzed. "But I can give you a choice," the man's voice echoed, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that wasn't empty but full of darkness. "Stay or become one of us." The words sank into Emma like a blade. One of us. The meaning behind it was horrifying. The hospital, the entity that had kept alive for so long, wasn't simply trying to torment her. It was trying to turn her into something else. Something not quite alive, but not truly dead either. What did that mean for me? Emma thought, what happens if I become one of them? And then the hospital began to shift again. The floors beneath her feet twisted like a living thing. The walls stretched and cracked, contorting into impossible angles. The lights above shattered, plunging her into darkness. The air grew thick, heavy with something dark, something that should not exist. She heard it before she saw it. The low, rumbling growl, the sound of something enormous moving through the corridors. Something old, something hungry. The creature, it was coming for her. And now, there was nowhere to run. The last thing Emma saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was a man, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You can't escape," he whispered again, and the world fell into silence. The end.